Leadership Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Leadership Story Talks is produced by Narrative, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Leadership Story Talks. In this podcast, Julienne, Ryan, and I, Jerome DeRoy, discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There are more people who identify as disengaged at work than there are who say they feel engaged. So we come from Narrative, which is a company that focuses on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling, and we employ a 7-step method to do so. And of course, we love having people on the show who have different perspectives, where we can kind of connect with them and connect you, our listeners, to their insights. And today we have such a guest that I'm really excited. Her name is Gianna Biscontini. Gianna is a nature-loving, dog-obsessed, best-selling author, founder, feminist, executive coach, and board-certified behavior analyst. She pioneers a vision of a healthier world of work through deeply personal executive coaching and in her thought leadership on the life-changing value of well-being-based cultures. Gianna has worked with celebrities, sports figures, and popular leaders, and has been featured in publications like Oprah Daily, Forbes, and Today. Well, Gianna, it's a great honor to have you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's great. And Jules, of course, as always, welcome.
Yes,
Great.
Always happy to be here.
Yeah, great to have my co-host with me today. And well-being is something I think, Jules, we've definitely talked about before. And I remember we had a guest who was talking to us about financial wellness, and how that was part of employee well-being initiatives, increasingly so. And so, Gianna, I was really excited to have you on the show because you have quite a holistic approach that's also really based on data and behavioral sciences. And so I'd love for you maybe to start just by telling us a little bit about your own journey of sort of coming to this kind of work and how did that happen?
Absolutely. It started when I was 2. I just always really loved watching people and had a great appreciation and curiosity for why we do what we do. And ended up really dedicating my life to that, because if we can understand why we do what we do, we can solve so many of our big challenges at life, in work, in relationships, internally, externally, climate, everything. And so I have a background in psychology and counseling and behavior analysis, as you mentioned. And so I really took this very circuitous road, but as you said, holistic approach to understanding the human condition and behavior. And so as a board certified behavior analyst, I am in the natural sciences, not the social sciences. So we get a really complex, deep background in running experiments and understanding the principles of behavior, and just really a multi-level view of humanity. And so we have a really unique view of why we do what we do. I started out in the clinical world. So I always wanted to be a pediatrician. So I was working with kids with autism for about 10 years and hit a ceiling. I didn't want my director's job because I knew I wouldn't be engaged, which I know is a huge subject for the podcast. And I felt myself getting disengaged. There was no challenges there for me. My environment was failing to support my growth through no fault of anybody. And I just knew it was time to leave. And so I thought, well, if I can work anywhere behavior exists, I'm going to find a problem to solve. So I started teaching neuroscience-based meditation courses on Thinkific, I think the platform I was using, and that took off. And through my research to support people through neuroscience-based meditation, I came across all of the research on how poorly our health is declining, how poor their health is affected by our work.
Mm.
And I felt this mic drop in my life of that's it. That's the problem that I want to work on, because I had been affected by culture that didn't support me in a lot of different ways. And I'm sure we'll get into that. And so I started my company, Workwell. And that was about 5 years ago, almost to the day.
Wow. Well,
Thank you.
congratulations. Yeah. And thanks for creating it, because it feels like one of the things that, I've certainly seen, and I'll share an anecdote to kind of illustrate this point, is this kind of increase in, at least seemingly on paper, that a lot of companies are sort of starting to pay attention and using the term well-being for their employees. And this was before the pandemic that I had this experience of one of our, I think we had a client in the Bay Area, and typical sort of startup that kind of made it. And so you walk into these beautiful offices, not many walls around, because it's all about how we can create better connections in the space itself. And then there's this incredible food bar, and it's all free, and and you can have all the healthy options you want. And then there was
Nirvana.
a massage. Yeah, I mean, there was a massage room there, and all these expenses were paid, etc. And and I thought, wow, if I worked in a company like this, I'd never leave. And then a few months later, I read this article about all these people leaving in droves from that same company. And I was like, well, I wonder what that's about. So I know that's one anecdote, and I certainly don't want to generalize, but I wonder if that's something, Gianna, that you could speak to a little bit in terms of that kind of disconnect between what seems to be something that's more and more top of mind, and the kinds of strategies, and maybe these are tactics, and maybe it's not actually part of the strategy, and that's the problem. But what do you see in this area, and how do you, what are the strategies that you've seen kind of work or don't work?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have heard stories very similar.
Yeah.
And the problem is that people never left, right? They really didn't have lives outside of work. And I think it's all very sexy, but then we habituate to it. It doesn't have the same effect. And so you can put as many perks in the environment as you want, but that's not culture. Culture isn't ping pong tables and kegs and nap pods and all of that. Those are variables added to an environment that could potentially have an effect on behavior, but you wouldn't know because you wouldn't measure it, right? And so it's throwing very expensive spaghetti over the wall, hoping something sticks, and then wondering why people are leaving the sexy environment. This is why understanding human behavior is really important, because when people habituate to those things, they no longer have their intended effect. And so what else is there holding that culture in place? What else is there engaging the employee? It's the work, right? Any of us could, I could shovel, leaves all day if I had an office like that. But after a little bit, you go, okay, but what else is there? And so these are just kind of these tactics that are shallow and really highlights the lack of time that was spent looking into what exactly the organization wants, and what the values are, and what the vision is, who the employees are. And so, we listen to all these podcasts, the top 10 habits of billionaires, and you go, great, I'll do that, and something in my life will change. But it's maybe not for you, right? We give away so much power to what everybody else is doing instead of analyzing the environment that we're in. And so when we work with culture and people say, well, this company is doing this, so we're doing that. I say, well, first of all, did you take a pre-measure? Do you have a pre and post measure in place to see what, if anything, changes? No. Okay. Well, that's something that you'd want to do before you make any changes to an environment. Second of all, how is that environment similar to yours? Are the employees similar in age? Is the work similar? Are you in the same city? What made you think that would work here? And usually there's absolutely no answer. It's, well, they're doing it and so we're going to do it. So it's just, taking these things and trying to make them fit. Third, employees see that. And while they're excited and they hit all the 5 on the Likert scale, yes, smiley face, we like it. Is it actually changing anything? Is it actually having a desired effect? And do you know what that desired effect is? And so, getting back to your question, the most successful things that we see companies do is pump the brakes a little bit and analyze their environment and understand what their people want, who they are, what their challenges are. They understand that there aren't blanket black and white solutions. We're all moving so quickly that nobody wants to slow down to do their really important work. But if you do that on the front end and it's purposeful, intentional, and structured, you're creating a well-oiled machine that's sustainable, right? You don't have the attrition like in your story where people are like, well, that was great, I'm out, because that's all there is. The smoke and mirrors aren't having the same effect anymore. And that resonates with employees. We can tell inauthenticity. Employees can see inauthenticity and band-aid solutions a mile away, and it can actually hurt morale and hurt well-being. One of the top components of burnout is cynicism. I don't feel like I matter. I don't feel like anything is going to change. I don't feel cared about. That's one of the only free changes you can make as a leader or as a people manager. And we miss it. We're missing the important parts. So the companies that do it really well understand the human condition and human behavior, and that it's not a one size fits all. And that the more you slow down and focus and analyze an environment and get to know your people, the better all of that works out.
Gina, what you said before just resonated with me, because I had an instant picture of a few years back being in an office, and there's always the flavor of the moment. There's always a company that's everybody's in love with, and they're like the cool kids on the block. And it was Google environment, and they bring all these analogies to office, and we're like, how does that relate to us? So when I heard you speak before, I was so happy, because I'm so curious to hear how you actually get your clients to pay attention to, and how you choose to use your research in the organization so they come away with something that's real and relevant to their working situation. But oh my God, I'm having flashbacks. So I'm listening to you, but I'll deal with that later.
We'll talk afterwards.
Yeah.
And that happens. And I think that people really want to feel cared for. And if I use the same response to everybody, if both of you come to me with a problem and the rest of my 10 team members come to me with a problem, and I respond the same way and say the same things, you're eventually going to get together and realize that this is a very generic expression of leadership, or a very generic expression of culture. And nothing makes someone feel more demotivated or less cared about than generic solutions, and so that has consequences.
The thing that really resonated with me was the making people feel like they matter, and that I didn't actually know that one of the number one causes of burnout is cynicism, and or it's behind it. I wonder what have you seen that sort of, I guess in my mind, what I'm hearing is that there's sort of the myth of what well-being looks like, and then there's the real data that you're talking about, I think, where it's sort of like, look at your own case before you start imitating others, feeling like that's the thing to do for you, but actually you haven't taken the time to look at your own data, right? And so I wonder, do you have any sort of examples or something that you've seen be particularly impactful in that way, where you're doing something that's specific to your own employees because of the data that you've seen? Is that how you work, first of all? Do you sort of go in and do the research or help assess where people are at, and then from there you come up with strategies?
Yes. So we prefer to start off with our assessment. So throughout, we're on year 5. And so throughout the pandemic, I took a big pause. I didn't want to be part of the noise. I wanted to just sit back and watch and feel and talk to people and focus on coaching. And I spent 2.5 years really watching and reiterating our assessment. And there's so much colorful research. There's so much more color in the research now that I just reiterated the entire thing because I thought it's a new world. Behavior. There are laws and rules that make us predictable. But there's a lot of color and creativity into how that's executed and where and when and why. And so we get into it all. So we took all of the things that we know about human behavior, reinforcement schedules, the 4 functions of human behavior, the 4-term contingency, which is how culture is created, all these scientific principles, right, that really elude most people if you're not in this field. And we built it into our assessment. So we're not asking high-level, complex, crazy questions. We're asking really thoughtful, intentional questions, trying to get a read on the environment. And you need to take the indirect and the direct measures and be able to code it on the back end properly to find patterns and to get a good picture of what is going on in that environment, what behaviors are rewarded and punished. So when companies talk about culture, like it's this thing in the corner over here, I start with reminding them and educating them. I really believe in educating my clients, right? Because nobody's heard of this stuff. And so we have a little bit of some of it's counterintuitive based on pop psychology or social research. And so I do a bit of an education first to talk about why we do what we do and what culture actually is. We have built culture between the 3 of us, just getting to know each other a little bit, right? You probably can be pretty sure if you threw out a racist or a sexist joke, I wouldn't find it funny, right? Like you're not going to get away with that with me. And you're probably not going to be rewarded or reinforced with a laugh or aren't you cool? And so that's culture. That behavior is probably not going to be rewarded, 100% not going to be rewarded. It could even be punished. I might have a talk with you about that, right? That wouldn't feel very good. And so culture is this thing that's created between us all the time. And so we lead with the education, we lead with the assessment. As a board certified behavior analyst, we put the analysis into analyst, right? You have to ask really good questions and get a picture. And so when we see consultants, there's room in this space for everybody. And I believe that a lot of people have good intentions. But when you come in with something canned and you say, well, we've done this here and here and here with tech and nonprofit and 5,000 employees and 50 employees and older and young people and homogenous cultures and heterogeneous cultures, and we do the same thing wherever we go, it might be a good start, but it's not at the level of depth where real sustainable change happens. And so we start with our assessment. We have 9 dimensions of culture, and we really help people understand what is going on in their environment. And it's partially perception. I want to know how employees are feeling, right? Perception is reality most of the time, but there are also really pointed questions where if the majority of people say this isn't happening here, I can take that to leadership and say, is this happening here? And it's a plain yes or no. It's not, well, I think, or she thinks, or maybe. It's all very concrete. And so you have to mix the concrete and the abstract, the head and the heart, the science and the art, right? You have to put all that together. And I didn't see any of that. We started out as a consulting company. I wanted to go in and do things. And then I assumed an assessment would be out there that was useful to us, and there wasn't. So within 3 weeks, we were an analytics company. So that's where we start. And then we have courses and keynotes and online courses and workshops and all that stuff afterwards. But you can take the insight from the assessment, the report, and give it to your team. And it's going to be a bit deeper than you'll see anywhere else.
That's great. Yeah, go ahead, Jules.
You're hinting at the part I wanted to ask about next. So you talked about the point where you had an aha moment about this is the work I want to do. Was there ever an aha moment of when you were immersed in a project that was needed something more, like you were saying, I can do better than this? Can you tell us about that? And it drove the fact that you created this assessment. There has to be a tipping point. Nobody goes out and says, I'm going to wake up one day and create an assessment just for the heck of it. There had to have been a pain point that you were on hot pursuit of eliminating.
Right. If you're a behavior analyst, you might wake up and go, I'm going to create an assessment because we're dorks like that. But you're right. Most people won't. I think it's just understanding, getting out there. I was an executive coach first. and just getting to know business and corporate culture. I come from academia and science and all that. And so getting into the environment, I've worked in healthcare, education, government, all these different industries. And as I was doing that, I realized, oh my God, the data that is used here is so weak. It's so light. There's not a foundation, right? And so what people were doing was assessing the people, not the environment. And so what we know about behavior is that our environments influence our behavior. We're behaving differently right now in this environment than we would at a happy hour, or that we would at a wedding, or that you would in a workplace in a board meeting, right? And we're designed that way. We're designed to discriminate right from wrong and look around an environment and go, okay, this is what I can do here. This is what's acceptable. We call that culture. And it's always different. We're always switching and flexing to some point. We're not completely different people. I mean, we might be, but this is how you hire the best person on day 1. And day 75, you're like, what happened to this person, right? Maybe they bait and switched you, but most likely you set an expectation during onboarding and recruitment. They came in excited, and the environment shaped them and whittled them away from what they said that they would bring to the table. And now everybody's wondering what went on. Now it's an emotional situation. And now people are resigning and angry, and there is really no way to step back and say, here's what the environment has conditioned me to do. Here's what our processes and procedures, or lack thereof, have influenced me to do. I didn't have adequate training, so I made it up because we have a culture where you can't speak up and talk about your mistake and ask questions, right? It's gonna anger someone. So I avoid that, and I'm gonna just make up my own rules, right? Everything is explainable. So once I started coaching and hearing from executives and presidents and seeing, I would coach a president and a vice president at the same time, maybe. And you see so clearly, it's no one's fault. You're coming from different perspectives. You have different information. Your environments are different. Your expectations are different. So it can all be pieced apart. And that's when we went from the consulting to the analytics, because there was nothing out there to measure the environment. We were measuring people. People are fallible. The environment is or isn't, right? The environment is going to condition you in one way or another. But letting people respond to these assessments and stuff, it muddies the waters, and people don't know their subjectivity and bias and confirmation bias and demand characteristics and all of that. So yeah, we wanted to look into the research and say, what do we know about environments? What do we know? What do we know about environments that produce happy, healthy, engaged, valued, cream of the crop, outcomes in employees? And let's build that environment and then invite the people in. They're more likely to be shaped in that direction, even if they're completely different outside the home, right? You're more likely to be successful if you create the environment and then bring in the people.
That question of environment, I think it's such a it's something that we probably took for granted for a long, long time. You go to an office and it looks like an office environment, and maybe there's a few perks here and there and things like that, and you enjoy more or less going to the office, or you have friends there, etc. But then the pandemic hit, and many of us had to suddenly go into lockdown, and suddenly my environment is no longer an office, but it's my home. And I wonder, from your perspective, how has that kind of influenced, your work, but also maybe even as you see it, human behavior within a what do we call an office environment nowadays? I mean, I know lots of people were remote before the pandemic, but I'm for those companies that have gone through being completely in person to suddenly being completely remote or hybrid, what are you seeing in those terms, in terms of that change and how people are adjusting to it?
Great question. Two things. Number one, there was research out of Stanford that is just genius and brilliant. We use some of it in our assessment, and it goes over the top 10 workplace exposures. I would call them variables, but he calls them exposures. 10 workplace exposures that when these exposures are present, you are at risk of severely declining your mental and physical health. And then obviously other things follow, like your performance after everything topples, right? It's all kind of snowballs. one of those things, highest on the list, was autonomy, having a lack of autonomy. And so when we got kind of shut into our homes, you didn't have a choice. You had to increase autonomy in some ways, right? I can eat lunch whenever I want, and I can go for we had increased autonomy in some ways, but not in others. You don't get a choice that you're home with 4 kids now, right? Like that was not a choice for a lot of people. Consequently, or conversely, when the pandemic was quote unquote alleviated or over, and we had the choice to go back to work, I watched companies make the assumption that you had to have culture, you had to be in the same environment, which is false. And they took autonomy away from their people again. So we spent 2 years kind of scrambling and getting our sea legs. And it's like, actually, I like being home with my kids for breakfast. I hate my commute, but I miss the people. The hybrid model is the answer because you're giving people autonomy, right? And when I talk to leaders that insist upon it being black and white, I say, look, I educate them about the autonomy thing. And then I say, look, this is why you need performance metrics, behavior-based performance metrics. As long as you engage in these behaviors every day, which we know will lead to this result or hypothesize will lead to this business result, great. You work with yourself and whatever hours in the day, and you have to come to meetings or whatever on Zoom, but like give people some of that autonomy. It has these well-being effects. So that's one. The second one, I started teaching neuroscience-based meditation courses through Simon Sinek's team. And I was teaching people how to create an environment within an environment, right? Coming down to blocking your visual field. Don't point your desk at something that is visually stimulating, right? You're going to be looking at your computer, you want to focus. So I really leaned heavily on my neuroscience, mindfulness, meditation background because I had attention and focus was one of the main dimensions of our first assessment. So I had like a 2.5-year runway on this, diving into the focus and attention we all need to be optimally successful. I leaned heavily on Cal Newport's work in Deep Work, his book, and what steals our attention. And I think UC Irvine, Gloria Mark, has some groundbreaking research on focus and brain science. So I really leaned heavily on our brains, right? Because we couldn't just say, oh, I work best when I leave my house and go to my office and I'm in a separate environment. You really had to recreate that. And so I did my best to support from that angle.
Wow. I mean, our listeners are so lucky today, and I feel the same way in terms of just all the resources that you're giving us. And we'll make sure to have that in our notes, the people that you just quoted and those studies. Fascinating stuff. We're coming towards the end of our time, and there's a question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, and we'll do the same with you, and that is there an experience that you've had that has shaped who you are today? You can kind of go back in time and say, oh yeah, that was a time that I can link back to who I am today. And of course, I always temper this question or say something about the fact that it could be a completely different answer in 5 minutes. So it's for this time, and we're not going to hold you to it. But it is for what does the answer feel like today?
Yes, the first thing that came to mind was, please, if you want to know it, I'll go read my book. It's all accidentally in there. I would say we've all been through a lot. I would say the moment where I was a child where, I grew up, my parents were married, I went to private school, I was like little Miss Prima ballerina, I took art classes, I had a very feminine, traditionally feminine upbringing. And within 3 months, my parents got divorced. I went to public school. I quit all the quote unquote girly stuff and started playing sports. And so there's this big phase change, line in my life where it was this environment and then this line and then this environment. And it influenced me to essentially live my life as one big social experiment, one big behavioral experiment. When I went to college, people asked me, what made you choose that? And I said, I didn't know anybody there. And I was curious as to what would happen to me and my personality, which wasn't really formed yet as a teenager. I was just so curious about what would happen if I plunked myself hours and hours from home in an environment where no one knew me. How would I dress? How would I act? What would become of me? And so obviously that influenced my behavioral work, but it really, you know, I can see very clear changes in my behavior. And I think that's what really informs a lot of my work today. I go back to those times and I lean so heavily on what we call in our industry a learning history. It's just your past and what you've learned. Doesn't mean that what you learned is right or wrong. It's just your experience. And we lean on that a lot. And so, yeah, that 3 months where everything was, I just became a totally different person. And then when I was 25, I went to grad school and everything changed again. I was back in more of a private school world, and I was in DC, and I was like single and living alone for the first time. And so these phase changes, these life quakes, as I think it's been termed, these phase changes in our lives are awesome opportunities for transition and reflection. And what do I want to carry forward? What do I want to leave behind? And it's the same for organizations. You know, every moment that passes is a missed opportunity to change and grow and evolve. And that's informed my mission to make the world a healthier, happier place.
You were your own first subject, a longitudinal study.
Absolutely. Always in progress.
Well, and it's such a great story because you know, it mirrors what you've been talking about and what we've been talking about around, you know, the influence of the environment on human behavior, and just suddenly your environment as a child had completely changed within the space of 3 months. And so, you know, how could that not influence you? And then, you know, similarly, you kind of made me think about it a little bit differently, because we're in the business of storytelling, and you know, it is what's behind that question. We like to hear stories of a more personal nature from our guests, and it's fascinating to me all the different kinds of answers we get to the same question, and they're all unique, but they're also very universal. You know, because as you said, we all go through these stages, and to see them, to kind of get that as an opportunity to see it as a transition, as you've really put it very well, better than I have just now. But you know, it's just like we all go through this stuff, and so why wouldn't organizations go through these transitions? They're made of people. Of course, it all makes sense. So thank you for answering that question, and you know, giving us a little bit of a glimpse, another layer of who you are. I really appreciate that. Are there ways, you mentioned your book, you know, we know your website and all these other resources, but are there things that you would like to point our listeners to learn more about you, about your work?
Absolutely. I'm just coming off a press tour, so my name is Googleable if you're curious about me, although that can be a boring subject. Yeah, I would point people to Workwell, W3RKWELL.com. And then GiannaBiscontini.com is my coaching, my book, more personal stuff is there, but there's the behavior nerd. There's the behavior nerd stuff that they can find there as well. And I love hearing from people and conversing, and I do virtual coffees, you know, week to week from just random people that reach out to me. So I think we're all in a reconnection phase. So I really encourage people to do that.
I love that. We are in a reconnection phase. Jules, any last thoughts?
I'm excited to hear more, because your data for good and for real sustainable change, I think, is so important. So I'm really interested in seeing what you're going to research next, and talk about some of the things you've been hinting at during this session. So I'm perpetually curious and want to hear what's coming up the pike from you.
Great.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. So we will keep our listeners posted. I just want to say, you know, thank you to everyone who's listening. And as always, you can visit our website, narrative.com, for information on how you can find, craft, and present the stories that will engage your audiences like nothing else has before. That's where you can find our podcast, our blog. If you haven't subscribed to our blog, you can go to your favorite, to our podcast, sorry. You can go to your favorite platform and subscribe there.
We're everywhere.
Yeah, we're everywhere you find podcasts, and on our website, narativ.com. we are always ready to listen to you. So thanks, Gianna, once again for being part of this, and we will keep you posted, and I hope that we stay connected so we can hear more about your really fantastic work. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You're so welcome.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narrative.com.